Hi, my name is Julie Chen, and I recently at PAX East 2024, I did a panel about how to make your first board game from ideation to production, and the feedback was really good. Unfortunately, we didn't get a recording of the actual panel, so I wanted to just do a uh, a reading where I just go through the slides and then hopefully send it to anyone who might be able to use it for making their first board game. So my name is Julie Chen, and I'm from Hawberry Games. And the two people who were really kind to join me in the panel were Emily Vincent from Pink Hawk Games and Nick Federico from Millrat Studio. Emily is working on her first Kickstarter at the end of this year, and Nick and his studio are also releasing something on Kickstarter soon. So please follow them on their social media accounts. So today we'll be talking about introduction to game design, whether you should self-publish or pitch to a publisher. We're going to do intro to game manufacturing, so whether you go for mass production or print on demand, intro to game logistics, uh, working with a fulfillment company or fulfilling yourself, and lastly, intro to game marketing, Kickstarter. Okay, so introduction to game design. This is the easy part. So if you don't have a specific idea for a game, I would say just play a lot of games. There are just so many different types of games with different themes and different mechanics and combinations of mechanics nowadays that playing a lot of games will give you a lot of ideas. And something that I heard when I first started designing games was that you should take your favorite game and change one thing about it, whether it's a mechanic or a theme, and then after that, you change yet another thing about that game. So eventually, after you change it like two or three times, it'll be a completely different game. And hopefully, it'll have its own unique charm to it. You can also join a game jam. Um, they have these online, they have these in person. So you can just kind of Google your area and see if there's something there. Basically, game jams will be maybe a few hours or maybe a day. And you just kind of work on one idea, like they'll give you the theme and they'll give you one mechanic. So then you have to kind of work around these ideas with the other people. And these are really fun, even if you don't come up with something automatically. I think just a game jam is super fun to do. And then lastly, I would say just live life, travel, try a lot of new things. A lot of my ideas for games have happened when I, yeah, was, abroad, when I was doing something new. And, game designs nowadays, the themes are so diverse. Like there's games about like stock markets, there's games about like fishing, games about wildlife, games about like cotton candy. So it really can be anything you want it to be. And then after you have an idea, the way you make your first prototype is literally just you write it down, you have paper, you have blank cards, anything you've got. Um, Once you have a better idea of what you're doing, you can get card sleeves and then just put like the paper inside of it. And then this way you can always change out the paper if you decide to update the design. And the card sleeves protect it. So that's something people usually do. And at this stage, when you're still working on the actual game, I would say focus on playability and not aesthetics because that's not really that important at this stage of the design process. So, playtesting your first prototype. Honestly, just get whoever you can. So, if you join local meetup groups, just meetup.com and then just find board game groups that just play games. I'm sure everyone will be interested in testing your game and giving you feedback. And obviously, you can play test with friends and family. But the more you play with people that you don't know or you don't really know how the way they play, it's better because you can see if your rules are easily explained to people who don't know you and don't know the games you like. And so I would recommend joining in-person and online prototyping groups. And there's several big ones across the country, such as Break My Game. They have in-person and online meetups. Protospiel, same thing, and Unpub, which is one of my favorites because I got really good feedback and met really great people from the times I attended Unpub. Um, And at an early stage, I would start by collecting emails and then making a mailing list. And so, what this does is that as you playtest your game, you find people interested in the game, and this would be kind of like an organic marketing, uh, because marketing will be really important to selling your game later on. So, collecting the emails of everyone who playtests, most people would just say that's fine. And like I mentioned, it would be good for marketing. Some people who are inclined, they will make a Facebook group or a Discord channel to keep people engaged and updated. So if this is not for you, for me, it's a bit tough. I don't do this, but some people say this is really helpful. And then after that, I would say it's time for you to maybe crack out some graphic design. If you have a friend who is an artist or graphic designer, they can help you make presentable prototypes for promotions. So if you have Adobe Suite, if you have GIMP, if you even have just PowerPoint, or a lot of free things, you can even use Canva to make presentable prototypes. You can actually use some print on demand companies to just print uh, cards or boards or boxes. And this would be quite expensive. So I would say if you're going to make an actual board game that's quite large, like regular size, that would be at least like $50 at these print on demand companies, because if you're just printing one, um, it's just quite expensive to manufacture that. So I would recommend the Game Crafter, Make Playing Cards, Shuffled Ink, and Launch Tabletop is a little bit more of a, they'll help you make the game and sell it to people. But I would say the first three, you can just make, one prototype and see how it works. Okay, so you have a playable game. Now, how do I get into the hands of millions of board gamers? So we got to the stage where you have the game, and let's say you hired a graphic designer, you hired an artist, or you are the artist and um, graphic design yourself, and you want to have creative control over the process. Like you already feel like you've done a large part of the creative process, and you don't really want to change any of that. Then I would say you should self publish. And so the rest of this presentation will be about manufacturing, logistics, and marketing. Well, let's say you don't really like the idea of starting your own small business, because that's what it will be. You should pitch the game to publishers. So we won't really be covering that in this panel, but you can answer in the Q&A and yeah, in the comment section of this video. So to give you a case study, my first game is called Cake Off, and this was my first handmade prototype. Basically, the concept of Cake Off is there's going to be recipe cards, and there's going to be ingredient cards and action cards. So here's an example of some recipe cards. I drew this out by hand. I just bought blank cards off of Amazon, and I just drew them straight on there with like a marker. And then after I was done basically doing all of the playtesting, I made a print on demand prototype with Game Crafter. And as you can see, it looks a lot better. And this is because I have graphic design experience. So for me, it wasn't too hard. But for a lot of people, you may not have the graphics at this level. You may want to just subscribe to some free kind of like icons or graphics kind of services. Like, for example, the Noun Project, you can subscribe to them and then get access to using their icons and their graphics to print on your prototypes. So the second part is game manufacturing, and this is the slightly challenging part. So I made the flow chart about whether you should go mass production or print on demand. So I would say even before you do a Kickstarter, you should think about the money you're going to be spending into this project. So if you have a couple $1,000s to spare, that's when I would consider mass production. And mass production usually means 5,000 units or more. Um, and some companies, they only start at like 1,000 or 2,000. So 500 is the bare minimum. And if you go that route, China is usually the place that people go because they have the biggest infrastructure for game design manufacturing. And you'll get the cheapest quotes as well as the highest quality. because they've been doing this for a long time. But if you don't want to go all the way to China, there are some manufacturers locally in the U.S. And but most of them don't necessarily do like intricate things like miniatures and customized meeples and things. So that's something you might want to consider. If you don't want to spend the money up front, I would consider the print on demand options. I mentioned earlier Game Crafter, Make Playing Cards, Shuffled Ink, Launch, Tabletop actually is able to help you print on demand, but like at a very high quality. So that's something to look into. So if you decide you're going to do a mass order, you should decide on the mass order quantity. And as I mentioned, most manufacturers have a minimum. And obviously, if you can imagine, the more you order at once, the cheaper per unit. Decide on a manufacturer. And then they're mostly based in China. And then after you do that, you should lock down the components specifically, like what the dimensions are. If you have cards, like what is the thickness and what is it going to be linen? Is it going to be matte? Is it going to be shiny? So these are some things that you have to really work out. And also custom die and meeples, anything custom that's not going to be like a normal board size or a normal card size, it will require like an extra one-time mold fee. So that's something to consider. So pro tips for manufacturing, cards and paper components are the cheapest to manufacture and ship. So for my first game Cake Off, I just did a game box with like 88 cards in it because as your first one, I think it's so much less to deal with. It's cheaper to do and it's easier to do. Yeah, so yeah, leave the meeples and the small part games, I think, for maybe your second or third manufacturing project. And then you also have to consider how many copies you want in one case pack. And a case pack is basically the box where it's going to be kind of placed onto a boat. That's the smallest it will be. Yeah, so you might want to talk to your manufacturer about that. And so, pro tips for designing, consider where you plan to sell your game. If you want to go retail, you should make sure that the front of your box is really really has great art, and it is eye catching. You want to have the title of the game on all four sides of the box, preferably. And then, if you're going to go to retail, consider adding a UPC code, and then consider getting safety tested. So, if you want to have your game listed as for under 14 years of age, you must get safety testing. So that's something to consider. That is, depending on the game size, maybe $1,000 to $2,000. So in the case study of Cake Off, once again, I'll just give you an example of the quotation sheet and how the specs look. So you can see that the game uses a magnetic box. It has playing cards, 88 of them. It has a rule book. And then it'll actually tell you the prices of each of these items broken down. Um, when you order like 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, obviously the more you get, the cheaper it's going to get. So you'll be looking at something like this when you get a quotation from a manufacturer. So finding a manufacturer is very simple. You can just Google, but a good database is boardgamemanufacturers.info. It'll break the results down by their ratings, their locations, their certifications. And some popular manufacturers are Longpack, Panda, Watts, Boda, Meja, but you don't have to use one of these. These are just the most, I would say, famous ones. And when you talk to a manufacturer, you approach them, I would ask them upfront about the turnaround times, like how long does it take to get a quote, provide a sample, and then the fully manufacture. Ask them about payment terms. So usually what they do in the industry is that once you sign a contract, and then you confirm the designs. Right before production starts, publishers pay 30% of the entire cost. And then when the manufacturing is completed, that's when the remaining 70% is wired to the manufacturer. You can ask them how many free samples they provide, and then if they do certifications and which ones. So, for example, I mentioned about safety. Some companies have relationships with, other like outside labs that will do safety certifications, and so that's good to know. Shipping, depending on how good the relationships are with freight forwarders, they may have a cheaper cost for the ocean freight, but beware that if they do have a connection like that, it might actually be an a bit of an inflated price because they have to get maybe like a middle agent kind of fee added in there. So you may want to look into your own freight forwarders as well. All right. So if you work with a manufacturer, most likely they'll be overseas, and so you have to decide on the currency. Most of the time, Chinese companies will give you prices in dollars, but you can ask for the Chinese price, which may be more cheaper on the long run, depending on the situation. And then also establish clear communications and expectations. So if the company most likely uses email, you should check to see if they're prompt at responding to you. If you prefer to just text, some companies will do WhatsApp or Facebook Messenger. So you can ask them to see if they can basically accommodate the way that you like to communicate. And so, back to the case study, the printed game of Cake Off looks like this. It is in a magnetic box. I'm just going to uh, get it out right now. So, it looks like this. Yes, it looks like this. And yeah, what we ended up doing was 500 units for our first print run from Kickstarter, and at this price, at this MOQ of 500 units, it came out to 332 each, which is quite expensive for this kind of small game. Um, but as my first print run, I didn't want to, print thousands and thousands of copies in case it didn't sell. So next is introduction to game logistics. And this is the pretty challenging part, so slightly harder than the manufacturing part. So, game logistics, what is logistics? So, it's basically the process of managing how resources are acquired, stored, and transported to the final destination. And then, in terms of board games, how to get your manufactured games from the factory to the end user. And so, if the manufacturer's overseas, you need to pay for shipping. So, we're going to do air freight or ocean freight. Majority of games that are larger than like a small box will do ocean freight. And then, how will you pay for getting um, the games from the factory onto a boat? And then, how are you going to get onto the boat, for example? Because you need to buy maybe a pallet or two in a container, but you can't buy the whole container. So you're going to have to work with maybe a freight forwarder or somebody at the factory who can help you with this process, not to mention customs clearance when it comes to your country's port. And then after they come here, you have a warehouse where you're going to store the games, or you're going to work with a distributor that has warehouses in different locations and send the games off to different locations to better coordinate, you know, wherever you need to distribute them, for example, to Kickstarter backers all over the country, or if you have different stores you're basically shipping it to, it's better to ship it to two or three different locations, one for each location that you're going to be shipping them to. So options for logistics are partnering with a fulfillment company. So there are tons of fulfillment companies in the world of board games, and what they do is they'll deal with the whole thing about getting your games over here and then getting from a warehouse and then sending them out to, let's say, Kickstarter backers. And these companies usually have connections, so cheaper freight, and then will handle customs clearance for you and things like that. Or if you want to just do it yourself, you could ask your game factory to just courier the games to your own house. And so upfront, it's cheaper, I would say, because you don't have to pay like a third party, like a distribution or freight forwarder. But it is a lot more complicated because you have to find your own ship and then do have customs on your own. So a lot of first time designers, I would recommend to work with some kind of freight forwarder, some kind of fulfillment company for like a Kickstarter. And so, how you decide on the company? So you have to think about where the warehouses are, um, because let's say you live in like New York, but then a company that you think you might working with is like in LA. Um, their warehouse is so far from you that if you needed to get some of the copies from the warehouse to you, it may be just really expensive. Whereas if you live in New York, I'm sure there are a lot of logistics companies that have warehouses in New York or on the East Coast that would make it much cheaper to do that. And also, if you are going to be shipping to Europe, for example, I would not recommend trying to fulfill orders from the US to Europe. It is going to be insanely expensive with VAT, and you don't want to deal with that. So, I would also work with finding a fulfillment company in Europe if that was the case. And then some logistics companies also do distribution to retail and Amazon. So, would you like them to handle this for you? If so, I would look for a company that does distribution as well as logistics and fulfillment. And you also have to think about warehousing or storage fees. So the majority of companies will charge you storage fees if you use their warehouse, and that is to be expected. So they usually charge by per cubic meter and per month. Also, there will be removal costs, basically sending the products back to you if you don't want to pay for storage fees or you want to sell them directly yourself. That's also something to consider. And also, if you're considering distribution, which I mentioned about distribution to retail, so retail price is usually 50% MSRP, and then distributors usually buy the games at 60% off MSRP. So, for example, if for Cake Off, MSRP is $20. The retail price is 50% of that, which is $10. And then if I sell it to a distributor, it's $8 is what I'm gonna get from that exchange. So if that's the case, if you're gonna be getting $8 for each of the games, your landed cost, which is the total cost of the manufacturing plus getting it over here, it better be less than $8 or you're gonna operate at a loss. So, case study, this game, Cake Off, is 4 inches by 3 inches by 2 inches, and it weighs 9 ounces. And so you're gonna have to consider when you're packing this up in a case pack, like basically the big container where you're going to be putting up a bunch of these. You can decide on the case pack size. Most of the time, it's by multiples of 10 or 6. So sometimes you'll have 6 in a case pack, 12 or 24 in a case pack, or 10 or 20. And then you have to calculate how many case packs you need. So if you're going to have a pallet is usually 4 feet tall and about 4 feet by 4 feet wide. So depending on how big your game is, you may be able to fit like 500 units or possibly 1,000 units on a single pallet. So that's something to consider when you're going to go with ocean freight. And so that tends to be slower. I would like give yourself 1 to 2 months for ocean freight time to ship from China to the States. But if your game is small like this one, 500 copies of this, it doesn't actually fit on a pallet. So air freight was actually more convenient and faster for me for this first print run. And then the last category that we're going to cover is game marketing, which is the most challenging part of the whole process by far. So, what exactly is it? It is the incredibly difficult art of convincing people to buy your game. And what kind of marketing are there? So, I'm going to start with the most obvious things and then go into the more basically things that you might not have expected are actually marketing your game. So, you can make social media ads on Facebook and Instagram. You can make videos. You can make basically images or like a slideshow of images to basically show how great your game is. This has, I would say, limited returns. Obviously, the more you spend, the more reach you'll get, but the reach doesn't necessarily convert, and that's something for a whole another panel that I would have to talk about, like ROI and like click through rate and stuff like that. So the next type of marketing I would say is social media content. So this would be you are going to make your own accounts on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, and then you're going to post about your games, talking about your games, your process of making them, you going to board game conventions, basically anything that's content that's naturally generated by you. This would be social media content. And then you can also basically do paid previews or paid reviews. So there are a lot of YouTube influencers nowadays on YouTube, Instagram, and their personal blogs. You can actually send them a copy of your game and then have them make a video. Or in the cases of people with more followers, you may have to pay them a couple $100, or some of them make a couple $1,000 per video. So depending on how big your budget is there. So, another big way to market your game is just by simply attending board game conventions. And it's actually a lot more difficult than I'm just saying it. It's board game conventions. But the thing is, you know, you have to pay for the board game convention to like go there. You have to pay for the airfare, or if you're going to drive there, you have to pay for a hotel for how long you're staying there. And that's just simply to go to a convention and then hopefully talk to people about your game. If you actually want to have a booth at board game conventions, depending on how large it is, it can be a couple $100 to a couple $1,000 to have a booth. So this is unfortunately a cost that you cannot really skimp on, because board games are still very much about community and word of mouth. So I would say, out of all of the things here, this is probably still the most um, successful way for you to market and talk about your games. This is a cheaper option, basically selling at holiday and street fairs. So if you live in a city, if you live in a smaller town, I'm sure they have like street fairs where they sell like, homemade goods or things like that. It's totally fine if your games are not homemade. You can still sell at these places. The engagement, it really depends on what kind of fair it is. I've been to an art fair where I had no engagement at all. Like the people there didn't even know what Uno was. So it was impossible to try to sell there. So for me, I haven't had the best of luck, but I've had some friends who really do well at selling at street fairs, because usually having a booth or a table there is very cheap. And, it's not that stressful because it's more of a relaxed situation. Another thing is, as I mentioned before, selling to retail stores. So retail stores like your local friendly game store, they're basically champions of helping indie or local game designers. And if you live in a city, I'm sure there's at least like two or three game stores in the area, and you can just visit them and show them your game and maybe demo it to the owner, and see if they're interested in buying it. And usually, if they are interested in buying it, they'll be more than happy to have you like schedule a time on a weekend to demo the game at their store to show it to people who come by. Because, like I said, um, the game industry is still relatively community based, so this is a great way to market. And lastly, but not least, talking to your friends, family, and anyone who will listen to you talk about your game. I mean, this is not, you're not making the next Tesla. You're making something that is to be played with people, and it's supposed to be a fun activity. So, even if you're introverted, even if you don't like talking about yourself, I would just focus on your game and why you think it is fun and a good experience for people. And so, I have not really mentioned Kickstarter that much, and that's because Kickstarter is less of a marketing platform and more of the culmination of all your marketing efforts. And if you want to go on Kickstarter, there are a few things you should consider before doing it. And the first thing I would say is that you will need some disposable income. So Kickstarter is supposed to be for, I have a great idea, and then let's see if people believe that and support me. And that used to be the case for Kickstarter, but nowadays, in the board game world of Kickstarter at least, it's not really about that. There are many prerequisites that you need to fill before you can actually be successful on Kickstarter nowadays. So you have to consider first the cost of Kickstarter. Kickstarter takes 5% of all of the funds that you gather, and then Stripe takes about 2.9% as the processor of the funds. And then if you go with a pledge manager, which basically um, is going to manage like the shipping and the logistics after the Kickstarter finishes, that might also take 1 to 3% of your funds. And one important thing for Kickstarter is that you need to make a preview page of your game beforehand, and try to get as many followers on that page as possible. I would say, yeah, like over 1,000, over 2,000. The more you get, the better you're going to launch on the first day. And also, am I willing to spend money on a Kickstarter video? So you need to make a video for Kickstarter pretty much. Otherwise, it's really not really going to get a lot of traction, unfortunately. You need to make a lot of beautiful graphics, vertical graphics on Kickstarter. That's just the way it is. Write impeccable copy to entice people to play your game, and you most likely have to pay for preview videos. So, my first Kickstarter for Cake Off, I didn't really pay for preview videos. I just kind of sent them off to a few reviewers on Instagram, and they were great. But I think that a hindrance for my campaign was that there was nobody like in a video talking excitedly about my game, and so I think that took away from people's maybe willingness to try it, since nobody was really just giving their honest feedback in like a video presentation form. So this is a game plan for Kickstarter. um, I will not go into it too much because this is just kind of the way that I've learned that you need to prepare for Kickstarter. I've done two Kickstarters now, one for Cake Off and one for my other game, Emotional Intelligence. And this is the knowledge I've gained from talking to a lot of people about their Kickstarter, talking to mentors in the industry about, this is how you should make a good Kickstarter. So I would say if you're thinking about starting a Kickstarter now, you need to start the work a year ahead of time. So unfortunately, like I mentioned, all these things you need to like kind of get into place before you launch, in order to have a successful launch of your Kickstarter. But even if you don't do all of these things, it's okay. It's just I think you're going to have a lot of stress if your campaign funds, and if it doesn't fund, yeah, it's probably because you didn't do all of these things. Because, like I mentioned, Kickstarter now is not so much like, hey, make your dreams come true kind of place. It's more of like, this is just kind of like a pre order system for a lot of people. And so that's the end of my presentation. If you have any questions, please comment in the comments below and I will try to answer. So you can contact me at contact@hawberrygames.com. And I'm the one who made this presentation. So you can contact me about anything related to what you heard today. And Emily is at bangkokgames@gmail.com. You can talk to her about game design, UX, UI, cats and tea. And Nick is at nickfeds26@gmail.com. And he wants you to message him if you have an idea for a game but not sure how to get it going. So thank you so much for watching, and I hope you got something out of this. Bye.